Hello everyone, welcome to Azure On Air. And in today's episode, we've got a very interesting person. He's Stephane Eyskens. He's a cloud architect and digital transformation advocate. He has got a particular interest for hybrid architectures, modern authentication, and security in general. So, Stephane is a Kubernetes lover and also an AI enthusiast. He's also proficient in development, infrastructure, and security. Apart from all this, Stephen is a very active blogger, author, and speaker, which also gave him an allocate of Azure MVP for 15 times. I'm very excited to host Stephen in our show today. Hi, Stephen.
Basically, one of the easiest and best use case for containers are microservices, right? So microservice architectures. You should know that basically many Azure services ship themselves as containers, logic apps, Azure functions, some cognitive services. So more and more, you can actually containerize an Azure service, or you have an image that is ready to be used, provided by Microsoft, that you can basically run anywhere. And so container apps, the goal, the value proposition of container apps is really to make your life easy. So the hard piece is managed by Microsoft, fully managed, and then you basically focus on deploying your code. Hi, I'm Rita. So thanks for having me today.
Yeah, the pleasure is ours, Stephen. And what are we going to discuss today about in our show, Stephen? Let's give a highlight about that to our audience.
Yeah, so basically we're going to discuss the container services, the container landscape in Azure, when to use what, and what it is to actually start a container journey.
Amazing. So I just got it from you because the very first moment when I asked for a topic, you told you are very fond of containers. So I just wanted to let people know what you're going to cover in this topic, and followed by that, I would also like to start the session with in a general question rather moving into a direct question based on Azure. Let's start with a general point that each person who's new to containers would have in mind. So, why does this service even exist? What is containers? Why containers?
Yeah. Well, actually, for me, containers are really linked to cloud native. You probably hear quite often about cloud native architectures and cloud native approaches. And I think that, of course, cloud native approach it entitles that you basically can fluently deploy an infrastructure, can release applications, let's say during business hours. That's what cloud native means in general. So you can achieve cloud native without containers, but I would say that containers are very good, will play very well with cloud native. And they bring the extra mile in terms of, especially container orchestrators, in terms of how you can deploy and release applications and in terms of resilience and so on. And so containers really bring this, of course, on top of, let's say, optimizing infrastructure, right? Because containers in general, let's say, will spare the footprint of the OS, right? So a container is lighter than a virtual machine, of course. And also they bring portability. So they bring a lot of, let's say, benefits. But also, of course, that comes at a certain cost. So you need to learn containers. You need to have your own landscape ready for containers. And then you can, of course, try to leverage cloud providers to make your journey easier. But let's say, in general, the reason why you would go for containers is mostly to gain flexibility, gain efficiency in let's say, in releasing applications, and so you would reach a better time to market, and you could optimize cost basically if you make a proper use of containers.
Super. So, having heard about why containers, I also have a question, like a sudden question that popped into my mind, Stephen. As you are a consultant, yeah. So, to what
Mhm.
type of domains do you recommend containers, and where do they use it?
Yeah, well, basically, one of the easiest and best use case for containers are microservices, right? So microservice architectures, because of course the whole point of microservices is to gain, let's say, in agility, to basically have different teams working on different services at the same time, having also some technical benefits like independent, let's say, scalability. So all of this can be very well accommodated thanks to containers. So that's basically one of the use cases. But of course, containers can be used for everything, right? That's the thing. So it's like just a paradigm shift compared to VMs, right? So, but of course, where it would make less sense is maybe, or let's say, when you will not have all the fruits, the benefits of containers, is probably when you do just a lift and shift, right? So lift and shift meaning, say that you have a monolithic application on premises, for instance, running, just to say something, on a plain old IIS web server, an old school ASP.NET, then you would need a Windows container. That is doable, but in that case, your goal is just to migrate something because you don't want to refactor the application, you want to lift and shift, right? In that case, of course, you can also use containers, but that's not where they will shine the most, you see? So that's something to keep in mind. Um, yeah, so basically that's one. So the usually use cases from companies are more in microservice architecture because there is also a growing adoption of this, and then again microservices and containers play well together. Also, anything that is web, right, e-commerce and so on, that's also something that plays very well with containers. Anything that's very dynamic, where you need frequent releases and so on, containers again can help. Well, basically they can accommodate a lot of stuff. Where I would be a little bit more reluctant, for instance, is hosting full database engines within containers, like clusters in clusters, and that is maybe not the best use of containers because that would also be some extra complexity. You see, so I would really see everything that's web related and let's say dynamic plays very well with containers. For the big systems like Oracle and so on, to be honest, it's possible, but I would not. It's certainly not the choice I would recommend. Let's say to go for, especially not when starting with containers.
Super. That was a brilliant explanation from the consultant, Stephen. So, I would
Mhm.
also like to know a little more in depth about containers on the technical perspective now. So,
Mhm.
as you said, the containers can be used in different areas, right? Also, we would
Yeah.
like to understand the container landscape in Azure. So, what are the different types of containers available? Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. So you have indeed. So the Azure offering is broader, right? Is expanding, let's say, year after year. So I would say here today, you have basically simple container services like web app for containers. Web app for containers is just Azure web apps, but you can run containers inside those web apps. And that is typically, for instance, one example where you could lift and shift some old ASP.NET application to Azure App Service container based. That's one use case, for instance. But usually here we will not be talking about container orchestrators. We're gonna talk about simple containers. Same for container instances, right? That's something that I use almost with every customer. And that is something that's very, very interesting for jobs, right? Background jobs, event handlers, or in event-driven architectures, where you can basically spin up a container, let it do what it needs to do, like handle, I don't know, a big file or well, do something basically, and when it's done, you destroy the container. And in that case, it's very serverless, by the way, and so cost friendly, very elastic. So that's another type of services in Azure. So container instances. You can run both Windows and Linux containers. Then you have more sophisticated container services like AKS. I'll come back to this a little bit. And Azure Red Hat OpenShift. These are really container orchestrators, very sophisticated. And then you have container apps. That's the last point container service in Azure. But you have even more than this. So you should know that basically many Azure services ship themselves as containers. Logic apps, Azure Functions, some cognitive services. So more and more, you can actually containerize an Azure service, or you have an image that is ready to be used, provided by Microsoft, that you can basically run anywhere. And so you can run that on premises, you can run that, let's say, in another cloud. It's just a container, right? So you can run it in any container environment. And on top of this, you have now more and more Azure Arc. That is, let's say, a service that allows you to manage, let's say, Kubernetes clusters across data centers, basically, right? Again, across clouds, across data centers. So you see that the container space is really gaining, expanding a lot in Azure. But I would say if you focus more on the use cases I was depicting earlier, so like microservices and so on, then typically you would choose between Red Hat OpenShift, Azure Red Hat OpenShift, so AKS, Azure Kubernetes Services, or container apps. And these are the three where you would basically be able to play with microservices mostly. The others are just more, let's say, for more static web apps or more, let's say, less dynamic workloads or tinier applications, right? If you use web app, okay, so that's basically a little bit the landscape that you have.
That, yeah, that was a good list of containers that we had an idea about. Having so much in hand, we obviously have a thought when to use what, or when to
Yeah,
get started with what. Yeah. So can you
yeah,
just help us with understanding which particular containers use case, and as well as
yeah.
how to get started with it?
Yeah. Well, basically, to get started, I think if you really start a container journey, going right straight away to AKS is maybe not gonna make your journey easy, right? So if we think about the complexity, right, container instances, it's very simple. Azure Web App Containers, it's very simple. So container apps, it's already a little bit more complex, but that's still simpler than the AKS. So I would say if you start, it's a good start. A good way to start is basically to start packaging your applications as containers, deploying them, running them as containers, because you will already have to adapt your CI/CD pipelines, maybe transition from DevOps, let's say, to GitOps. Oh, well, if you just start, maybe DevOps, that's still okay. But so basically, to get started, it's easy to use, let's say, Azure Web App Containers and or container instances, right? Depending, of course, on the use case. And that is a way to at least package your applications containers and adapt a little bit your CI/CD pipelines. But that will then be quite limited in terms of use cases you can tackle. And so when you, let's say, have more complex applications or really when the benefits of a container orchestrator are, let's say, important for your use case, then you have to, of course, envision AKS, container apps possibly as well. So container apps, just to describe it a little bit more, it's the last born service from Microsoft, and it has Kubernetes behind the scenes, okay, but it's fully managed by Microsoft. So you don't see it, and so it includes extra components like Dapper, which also gains in popularity, and Kida. Kida, it's Kubernetes event-driven autoscaler. And so container apps, the goal, the value proposition of container apps is really to make your life easy. So the hard piece is managed by Microsoft, fully managed, and then you basically focus on deploying your code. So it reminds me a little bit Service Fabric Mesh. That was something that Microsoft attempted to deploy, let's say, or to popularize a few years ago. It didn't really went well, but I think container apps. I hope at least that it's gonna have a better. Or that's going to be more successful. But that's the same purpose, really try to hide the complexity of Kubernetes, right? And so basically, getting started with container apps. If you have a microservice use case today, you know nothing about containers, then container apps is definitely something to look at. It's still the early days of the service, so I think it's also important not to expect, enterprise grade features from day one. Okay, by enterprise grade features, I mostly think about security. You know probably that security is really important in cloud applications in general, and I think companies tend to try to be even more secure when they go cloud than what they have on prem, because there is always still this fear a little bit of cloud. You still see that in some industries and some companies, so they will actually do maybe double effort in security in the cloud than what they do on prem. And so container apps, let's say, comes in multiple flavors, but it's still not at the same level of AKS in terms of how you can control, let's say, network traffic, how you can isolate workloads. That is by no means comparable today. It will probably evolve, right? But I suppose that Microsoft will keep it quite simple. Otherwise, it will become as complex as Kubernetes, right? So the goal is to try to find the right balance between something that is easy to get started and that brings a lot of value, versus something that you can control to the maximum extent, but then becomes more complex. And that's the case of AKS. Okay, so AKS, same with Red Hat OpenShift, but I have less experience with that, so I'll, let's say, focus more on AKS. So AKS is really the Swiss knife container service. You can do everything with AKS. So let's be very clear. But then, of course, you have some. The learning curve is steeper. It's Kubernetes. It's not only Kubernetes. It's the full ecosystem. So it's a Pandora box. When you start with AKS, then you will have other tools like, okay, which ingress controller to choose, which scaler to choose. Well, Kida is usually the answer for this one. It's an easy one. But you have which CI/CD tools, Flux, Argo CD. You have a lot of tools basically that you will need to learn and manage. So network as well. So Envoy, all these ecosystem solutions that come on top of Kubernetes, right? All of this you have to learn that. And that, of course, is very nice. And you have incredible tools, and you really have all the promises of cloud native. As I said, if you have a major AKS environment, you can indeed do releases during the day, during business hours. It's not like the old school way of planning a release over the weekend, right? This is really something you can get. That's really cloud native, but you don't get there in overnight, right? You really need to invest time, effort, energy, and money in the end, because this is not free, to get this, let's say, to get most of the service. You see, so right, so getting started, container apps for microservices and so on, really easy to get started. Not yet at the level of let's say full blown service yet, but early days. So keep an eye on the evolution. Easy other stuff to really get started is container instances, Azure Web Apps, and then for, let's say, any use case, but then always a little bit more complex, AKS, or Red Hat OpenShift, Azure Red Hat OpenShift. Of course, you also have Red Hat outside of Azure. So that's even the most commonly used flavor. That's maybe a little bit the big picture.
That was really a enlightening answer from you, actually, Stephen. We just got to know when to use what and how to segregate each one based upon the use cases. So, having dealt with a lot of customers in your end, can you just share us with a real-time container journey from how they started and how the business evolved and how it's going now?
Yeah. Well, basically, that's indeed not neutral to go for containers. So if you're really about starting your container journey, then I think that what you need to take into account is, well, of course, the security, right? So dealing with security in containers, it's different way to deal with security than let's say in the non-container world. You also have to make sure that your developer machines, so if you are, especially for large enterprises, they have VDIs, or they have maybe laptops, dev laptops, right, that are not especially configured to actually be able to work with containers, right? Containers means that you will need something to be able to debug locally. So maybe you're gonna run a Docker desktop, a Minikube on your developer workstation, on your VDI. So it all tooling, let's say, that you need for developers to be able to just let's say locally debug something. And then also, if you really go for microservices, then at some point you might end up in applications where you have dozens of services, which you can't replicate locally on the dev box, right? So you will need to, let's say, use tools like Bridge to Kubernetes to, for instance, be able to debug, let's say, some piece of code on your laptop or your VDI, but let all these services and their dependencies in the cluster, so that you don't need to replicate this locally, because you just can't, right? At some point, you will never have enough RAM on your machine or your dev environment. But so the dev environment is something that's often overlooked, right? And then people start to realize, okay, yeah, this doesn't work, or this, or for instance, in let's say big companies, usually they have what is called CASB tools. So CASB tools really something that checks all the basically the calls that your machine is doing to internet and anything basically, and they often interfere with containers by because they inject certificates, for instance, that are not known by Docker or not known by your Minikube, and so that actually makes the life of developers quite hard. So that's one angle, right? Make sure that you have a dev environment that is actually suitable to develop in the container world. Then, of course, the biggest work for me, the biggest area of work is in the CI/CD, so DevOps. Usually, you see, especially if you go for solutions like Kubernetes, you will see a transition from DevOps to GitOps. So, and it's not only words. So, in terms of mindset, it's the same, right? You want to deploy stuff fluently and so on and so on. You try to break the silos and so on. That remains the same, but the tooling is different, right? In DevOps, view DevOps, you have build pipelines, release pipelines, and then you would push your stuff, your application with release pipelines, even if it's YAML pipelines. All in all, still have the concept of release pipelines, while with basically GitOps, it's really the source of truth is your repo or are your repos, and then basically you have components in the cluster itself like Flux, Argo CD, and so on that will basically monitor those repos and deploy themselves when something needs to be deployed, right? So it's a different tooling, different way of working. You get rid basically of release pipelines. But there is a lot of work there also because say that you are using Azure today, and let's say you use Azure App Services, I don't know, Azure Functions, Azure SQL, and so on and so on. You will actually use maybe ARM templates still, or Bicep, or Terraform, right? These are the usual suspects. But that's not the same tools that you're going to be using for Kubernetes, right? So Terraform has a provider, and so you might still use Terraform for Kubernetes itself, but usually you're going to use more Helm charts, YAML, maybe also some YAML, let's say YAML files, and then these solutions like Flux and so on will actually deploy your stuff for you. But you see, so it's a different ecosystem, let's say, in the CI/CD space, and I think that's really a big area where you need to invest time, money, and effort. And that's something that companies need to realize, right? If they go for the full container journey, they really need to work hard on their CI/CD story. And then, of course, in terms of our architecture, you also have a change, let's say some changes, but I would say it's maybe less disruptive on that level. And security, right? Security, you really need to envision security differently, right? Because in the full Kubernetes environment, everything is as code basically, right? Including the network is as code. And that is not yet something that is well understood, or even not something that is especially wished by all companies, right? So because sometimes they might lose or have the impression to lose control over what's going on, at least traditional security teams. And that is very disruptive towards security practices. Okay, so these are, and also scanning your image and so a lot of efforts to do in the security field as well. So it's a whole universe basically.
Fantastic. That's a huge universe, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a brilliant session that we had, Stephen. Lots of learnings, lots of new things that we got to know. When to use what was the highlight of the session to understand the real potential of containers in business. And we usually have a quick request from us in the end of the session to our speakers. Since we bring in a lot of Azure experts into this session, we always have a point to have a quick tip from them. So because you've come through a long journey in Azure, so can you give us a tip to the budding Azure beginners or people who are interested to move into Azure? Would you like to give them a quick tip in the end of the session now?
Oh, yeah, well, quick tip. Yeah, the thing is, Azure is very broad. So maybe to find a lot of tips, you can of course go to the tips that are available on the serverless website. But no, quick tip. It's actually not that easy. There are so many tips. Well, Yeah, there's nothing that comes to mind. Let's say as a quick tip to get started with Azure. Maybe start. Yeah, quick tip would be start small, right? Try to start with a use case that is not already the biggest application you ever developed in your company. Try to start small to explore and let's say get acquainted to the cloud, and then once you know a little bit better where you go, then you can start to envision harder use cases. I would say this. Maybe that's a tip,
Thank you.
right?
That was a small tip, but very on point tip. Start small and then grow big. Yeah.
Yeah,
So, since Azure
indeed.
is very vast and very broad, taking
Yeah,
tiny steps would be great, and it would be even effective rather than giving a big leap. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
Because even if you start small, oh sorry, even if you start small, you will anyway have to look at these different areas that I've been talking about. And so CI/CD, security. Even if you start small, it's gonna be disruptive towards your traditional way of working. So then it's even more the reason why you better start small. Otherwise, you might be just overwhelmed by all the new stuff that you have to handle. Okay.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen, for your time in giving us so much of knowledge in a short span of time. So the last 25 to 30 minutes was awesome listening to you, and I hope the audience are also benefited out of it. Yeah, and we are also associated a lot with Stephen in terms of blogs and lot with Savales 360, and I hope our association with the community also continues. Thanks a lot, Stephen.
Cove.co